So welcome to those who arrived slightly late. This is the masterclass from the Urban Design Group to see the presentations of the final shortlisted schemes on the Design Codes Awards. Should probably mention that this is the short list, and there was a long list that was selected by many judges, and then a group of 5 judges shortlisted these 3 and decided on the winner amongst these 3. Our judges were, for the final winning entry, which we'll reveal in the end of the session, were Alan Thompson and Scott Adams. Those are the co-chairs of the judge, Angela Koch, Daisy Narayan, and David Rudlin. I suspect they're all in the audience as well. And we may hear in the end a little bit about their comments to the schemes and why they've selected the winner that they have chosen. We will have 3 presentations, 10 minutes each, followed by 10 minutes of questions from the audience. And in the end, we'll let everyone know who's winning the category for design codes. So I'll probably introduce the first group of presenters. We've got Richard Guise and Fiona Webb, and they'll do the first presentation on the Somerset West and Taunton District Council's design guides. And then we'll have 10 minutes after for questions. When you're about sort of 2 minutes to the end, I'll raise a hand and let you know. But we'll probably make a start. You can share your screen, and then we'll go from there. Over to you, Richard. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Can everyone hear me? Yeah, I'm assuming they can.
Yes, I can.
Hi. Thanks very much for this opportunity for us to share our experience of setting up the design guide. I'm Richard Guise, architect planner and lead consultant on the design guide. And with me is Fiona Webb. She was the manager of the project and is responsible for major projects in Somerset Council. The authorities have slightly changed, but the guide is still going to be there. So I thought the first thing we might do is just locate ourselves. Somerset is now being a unitary authority. So that means that the 4 districts are now become one. And the design guide, as you can see, was commissioned to cover the southwestern part of the area that you can possibly just about see. It says former Somerset Western Taunton district. So the guide is still very much in operation. So I was just saying that the district for which we did the guide has now been subsumed into Somerset County, but plays a relevant part in the whole of the county. So next one is that we considered the design guide as part of a suite of documents because Taunton itself was designated a garden town. So at the same time as we were developing a district-wide guide, we were also looking for guidance, producing guidance for the garden town. So the guide itself, we felt it very important to hoist our banner to say what design was about, and being a multifaceted activity, you can see on the cartoon to the right that it involves so many aspects to integrate in the design process. And we were making the comparison with government guidance saying more or less the same thing. I think it's very important to just say what we're about generally. And we felt that not only should the guide be guiding on the principles of design and development, but also emphasize the sort of process that we felt that was important to get to satisfactory design solutions. So from left to right, we've wanted to see in all design and access statements parts which would address these various aspects. For instance, understanding the brief, and very importantly, appraising the context or setting of a site, then the site itself, and see how those things come together to influence the design concept and then carry on to the design process. So we wanted to see that process happening. And for instance, this was an indicative diagram to show, first of all, how the site should be seen within its context, and then an understanding of the site constraints and opportunities. And then before going into a detailed design, which often doesn't seem to have any relationship to the previous two stages, we feel it's very important to consider a design concept, and we had guidance on that. So this is just a small taster of some of the illustrations, and I did think about calling this presentation "Where Do We Draw the Line?" because very often in design guidance, if you have absolute minimal graphic indications, people say, well, it can mean anything to anybody. If you have a diagrammatic illustration of what you want, they say, well, is that it? So we've erred towards the latter, but very much stressed in the guidance that the illustrations are to be seen as indicative, and we welcome that to be a springboard for innovative design where that can happen. So it's very important, we feel, for applicants, but also for planners. And it's very important that the design guide is not purely just the local authority saying what they want, but it's also informing the planning staff, the development management colleagues, the members, the elected members, everybody, the sort of process that we think is important. And it seemed to us that it's very important to go from the large to the small, to go from understanding the context and the site, then structuring, looking at buildings and plots, materials, and then details. Going the other way is the path to confusion and to discussion of minor points which don't really address some of the big questions. So the big question at the top. At the end of each section, we had a kind of checklist of have you thought about type of questions, which we felt was good, as I say, both for the applicants, but also for development management colleagues to think about how they would frame recommendations. So to all urban designers, I guess this is relatively familiar stuff, but we, on the top three diagrams, we were at pains to say that if there is a density requirement, it doesn't have to be seen as uniform, that you can have density fading from front to back or from core to periphery. And then looking at structuring in terms of streets and places. We were very fortunate in developing the design guide at the same time as the local authority, highway authority, was considering their standards and revising those. So we had lengthy discussions and negotiations with highway authority colleagues to hopefully try and mesh in the general approach in Manual for Streets to guide both sides, as it were. So, for instance, thinking about the block, but thinking that the block, you know, very often we see the block as being something that is fairly rigid, and saying that it can be manipulated to follow contours, the character of the streets around, the type of tenure and density can be altered within the block, because in the area that we're looking at, we've got one large town, Taunton, but a number of very small towns and villages. So there's quite a range of development, and you know, not all needs should be in any way the most urban of urban design. So next, and what we've tried to do here is show that sustainability principles and urban design principles can go hand in hand. Here on the sustainability principles, you can see how landscape has been considered functionally, rain gardens, plenty of absorbing spaces, ponds and community orchards, street trees, gardens themselves, green walls, etc. And the next slide shows the same layout in terms of looking at flexible blocks and central areas for neighbourhoods, all within walking distance, the streets being as convenient for walking and pedestrian penetration as much as they are for vehicles. We felt that it was important to emphasize that
got a couple of minutes, 2 minutes left.
Thank you very much. To volume house builders, that they ought to develop a typology of house which contributes to street making. And I guess this is the basis of good coding. So, you know, building types that turn corners, building types that address focal points, building types that are adjusted for slope, building types that are pivotal buildings. So we went through about 12 types that we would encourage people to think about. Also thinking about things like hierarchy of streets, next, home zones. These were developed with a highway authority. And then very importantly, how do we learn from locality? Looking at patterns of development that's been built up over time. Districts are not homogeneous, that have different characters, and we stressed an analysis of those characters, and that there is a typology of inherited buildings which are important, and the ways in which buildings have traditionally related to the landscape. Finally, very important that development management colleagues are tied right into the process, and we had a series of training sessions and programs, both with development managers and with volume house builders and with members, and that's continuing. So thank you very much. Sorry, we had a few glitches at the beginning, but hopefully people have seen all the images, and we'd be very happy to answer any of your questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Richard. Any questions from the audience? Please put your hands up if you can. No questions as yet. No questions as yet. I can ask a question. I thought your graphics are actually quite engaging. They're actually quite evocative, and that's fantastic, because you can actually see. I think they're more interesting than sometimes some urban design diagrams. They tend to be quite abstract and kind of difficult to interpret when they're sort of overpopulated with rules and dashed lines and arrows. They tend to be quite abstract, and your graphics are actually very evocative and easy to understand. But was that a sort of conscious decision? And then at the same time, I think the language is slightly more loose than the graphics themselves. Was that a debate, or how did you get to that balance? Because it seemed quite interesting in what you showed.
Yes, I guess over the years I've developed a kind of technique which involves this sort of informal aerial perspective and tying in handwritten annotations, and it's often found that people say exactly what you have said, that it's engaging, because in the end we've got to engage with people. There are so many urban design techniques that, as you say, there's so many blobs and arrows and everything else. So it's a tight line to draw, and that's why I said that I think that the whole process is a question of where we draw the line between being seen as being prescriptive, but on the other hand, trying to indicate a kind of sense of what we want, because this is a rural district very keen on its heritage, and if you give something that looks abstract, it wouldn't engage people. They would say, well, this is nothing to do with us. So we wanted to embed this guidance in the district that we were working in.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Do we have any other questions from the audience, or you can also use the chat to type in your question if you prefer?
Can I just add that we did, whilst this is a design guide, it's also guides coding, and we have a section on coding, and also the idea that we wanted to press that typologies, people should think about the types of house, not just to sell in terms of this is the Albemarle, that's the Blenheim, but a question of this is a house that is designed to turn a particular corner, to create a key group, to address the edge of a development, etc., etc. So types related to roles rather than just how many bedrooms.
Thanks. Interesting.
May I ask a question about materials?
Yeah.
How important is the use of local materials to obtaining distinctiveness, would you say? And what can be done to ensure that there are local supplies?
Exactly. We're fortunate in that there are suppliers of stone, not huge quantities and quite expensive, as you would not be surprised to know. Our analysis of each of the character areas is based on the materials as well as the geology and the geography and the topography, and they all, as you know, work together. So what we would say is that we would encourage local materials, including locally manufactured brick, but also stone. And there are very different stone areas in the district. It's amazing how rich it is. But where there is a scarcity, use that on key buildings or on things like key boundaries, and then use a tradition which is quite widespread in this part of the world of using a type of render, the black bitumen base to the building, and also there's a strong tradition of particular tiles, roofing tiles in the area as well. So whilst what we don't particularly want is ersatz materials, you know, sort of concrete dressing itself up as particular stone. We'd rather have sparing use of stone and then default into appropriate brickwork and render rather than try and do fake materials.
Okay, thanks. But in the last couple of minutes, you have two questions come through the chat. One is from Judy Holm in Miami. So it's great to have an international audience. Hello. Have you encountered resistance to the climate and sustainability elements by some of the stakeholders? And how is this addressed? And I'll read the second question so you can answer both. Is the question from Grant Gibson. Is this a design guide or rather a design code?
Right. The first question, yes, very much so. This local authority was one of a number who declared a local climate emergency. we've worked very much with the specialists in sustainability and resilience, particularly in flooding. And we have worked with various bodies, stakeholders, on the design of housing for sustainability. So we have worked that in. In fact, there are a number of pages that I could point you to. But yes, I think also the fact of learning from the locality means how buildings have traditionally responded to place, climate, exposure, things like river valleys, etc. On the thing about codes and guides, what I think that here we've got is mainly a guide with guidance for coding, so that, for instance, we are saying what the general principles are to put in the code. One should always start with a strong vision about what you want to achieve from coding. Coding can't do everything. It has to be within the general context of the approach of the design guidance. So we have got guidance on coding. That's why we are very keen to tie in the street hierarchies as well as housing typologies, which are the basis for a lot of the coding. I'm conscious that I've taken up a lot of the airspace, which is one of my many failings. And I wondered, Fiona, whether there's anything that you would want to say in support of any of these aspects at all.
I was just going to mention that we did actually enter the category of SPD as part of this process. So it is an SPD. But as Richard's mentioned, it includes in terms of coding.
Yeah.
And that advice and guidance.
Yeah.
Okay.
And we have we have excellent colleagues who are working on sustainability full time, and we work very much with them in the development of the guide.
Thank you, Richard and Fiona. Thank you very much. I think we'll move on to the next presentation. We'll move on to Jane Manning from Alexis and Morisson, who's the second shortlisted design code. And she's going to talk about the Hounslow design code. Over to you, Jane. You're able to share your presentation with us? Yes, we can see it. Perfect. You probably want to, fantastic, put it on full screen. I'll let you know when you've got a couple of minutes left, and then we'll have obviously the 10 minutes for questions and discussion. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you, Anna. That's great. So I want to talk to you about the Hounslow, which is a character sustainability and design code, SPD, imminently about to be adopted following formal consultation over the summer. It's been a huge piece of work and a really collaborative piece of work with the London Borough of Hounslow. It's had a lot of ambition in it, and that kind of collaboration and support from Hounslow has been huge. So lots of planning officers and urban designers, including Louisa, who's in the audience today as well, have done a huge amount of work, having written sections of it, helped us kind of bring other pieces into it. There's been ambitions for it to be a one-stop shop. It isn't, but it tries to go as far as possible for applicants and local communities so that they have as much as possible in one place. I suppose importantly, it sort of represents, I suppose, that sense of ambition of Hounslow wanting to be quite a pioneer. And so the project started life in the summer of 2020, that being kind of 6 months before the National Model Design Code was launched, but a real sense of lots of us within the team and within Hounslow knew what might be coming forward within the NMDC, and so a desire to see could we start that process and get towards sort of being one of the first design codes to be adopted. The starting point was there was already an existing character study, an amazing resource, a sort of brilliant piece of work, which was really valued by local communities in particular, who'd worked sort of very strongly with those putting it forward. But it was very fine grain, and that was leading to issues in terms of planning officers being able to use it on a day-to-day basis to look at applications. So there was a need to look at quite the granularity of the analysis and the guidance to help inform future guidance, and crucially what we used as a base for design codes. So our work was sort of informed particularly by that, but also by lots of other pieces going on around it, including master plans, both existing and emerging, and the intention that it would inform future local plan reviews and crucially decision making on applications. This slide sort of tries to bring together kind of everything effectively that we looked at through the process. It started very much with trying to draw as much as we could in from the existing study, but it was about adding lots of layers, lots of data, and drawing as much as we could in, not just physical, but also thinking about how societies had shaped the different places within Hounslow, sort of from kind of Chiswick in the east, all the way through to Feltham in the west, and very different societies and how those have changed over time. We looked at lots of different scales, and that became a big part of sort of discussing quite how we deal with guidance versus codes, where it was appropriate to bring codes in and at what scale. And so that was looking at borough-wide level, at areas, breaking down the borough into 6 areas, also at neighbourhoods, but also thinking about site types as well, as sort of whether it's backland development or whether waterfront development. And so there was a lot of discussion of quite where we pitch things, and lots of work with the community to get that right. And so I'll give you a few windows into what we've got in the final piece. But I suppose within that, it means that in its entirety, it's a big piece of work. There are lots of parts to it. And a bit like with Somerset, a sort of sense of needing to bring people into the process that we wanted them to follow. And so that was about taking them through the different parts of the final output, thinking about sort of what they use as evidence, how they respond to borough-wide principles and codes, and then how they work through the level of detail to make sure people were really demonstrating that they are taking character on board. There was lots of pieces that we fed in, that existing study, but then lots of GIS-based research, lots of site visits, but crucially a lot of engagement. And that started with working with development management team and an officer workshop to really understand actually what the issues were they were experiencing with applications, then talking to the wider public about their concerns, and then working through a series of iterative workshops and understanding exactly how we might be able to turn these things into codes, what might be more appropriate in the level of detail we should bring in. As part of that, because of where we were of NMDC just being launched, there was a need to actually be able to explain to people what we meant by design codes, what the parameters of what could be in, what couldn't, what the future of design codes might be, and therefore the sort of level of importance people needed to give to it. And so we did a series of videos and posted those online in advance of all of the workshops. Through all of that input, we were able to sort of bring together quite a clear picture of sort of local distinctiveness and what made each part of the borough particularly distinctive. And within that and all the layers, a sense of where there were particularly consistent pieces, and perhaps that was making some areas more vulnerable to change, or areas of diversity with some potential, in some cases, for greater sort of opportunities for growth. A key part with the community was about really understanding where we sort of get the scale right for really understanding character. And so we ended up with these 6 areas and neighbourhoods within each of those. And a lot of the guidance and codes focuses around those particular boundaries. So with a few minutes left, I'll just do a bit of a kind of dive into some of the guidance to sort of give you a sense of quite how we sort of dealt with the scale and what was appropriate at each level. At the borough level, there was a lot of discussion at what could we say at this scale, a big desire from the council to push whatever we could up to this scale, particularly the sustainability aspects, and communities backed that up in the sense that they didn't want sort of different kind of thresholds being applied at different parts of the community. So it ended up with a sort of sense of a kind of big, broad statements about principles of what we wanted to see. And that covered a range of aspects. Some of these are on the screen, but this sense that every neighbourhood in Hounslow deserves high quality context-led design, well-connected streets that prioritise walking and cycling, through to lots of the aspects that you would expect around kind of housing that meets the needs of people. But each of these broad statements were then supported by what was actually required in order to demonstrate that principle had been met. Other parts of it, though, also picked up particular aspects that were universal and real assets across the borough. So some of the oldest routes, like Staines Road, kind of ancient old Roman roads, of how those are embraced and given new life moving forward, better recognition of blue infrastructure in particular, and then last but not least, a sort of real emphasis on reuse and understanding that heritage across the borough was very different, but all was valuable, and then a need to really sort of recognise that everyday heritage in particular. There were wider bits around resident engagement and just emphasising those pieces as part of the statements, and then particular requirements for each application to demonstrate a good understanding of context, and they had to demonstrate how they'd used lots of the evidence within the SPD as part of that, but also to show how design options had been developed and refined and how they were meeting the wider requirements. Two bits that we particularly looked at that borough-wide level were around, could we set coding around urban greening? And there was a real desire to see, could we kind of really bring kind of the urban greening factor analysis of existing neighbourhoods into sort of underpinning resilience in the future. And so we set a kind of base level of a code around urban greening at the borough-wide level, with a commitment to update that and rise that level effectively as sort of further local plan reviews take place. The other bit was around tall buildings, which is a big local issue, real desire to kind of identify areas that wouldn't see tall buildings. That was sort of big local priority, but also with kind of sense of kind of where things might be appropriate, not where they sort of absolutely could just happen, but where they could be. And then just to give you a bit of example into some of the more detailed pieces. So one key aspect was resolving the level of change that you might see in different areas. And so sort of on that spectrum from conserve through enhance to transform. That then applied down at the area level and provided particular guidance around some of those areas of transition and enhancement in particular, to give further guidance of what was required. Wider design objectives across those areas, and then at the neighbourhood level, a really kind of sort of fixing of what particular things needed to be considered. And I suppose in the top right hand corner, that grey box is the really key thing, that we coded building heights at the neighbourhood level, and that was really felt to be important by local people. So it sets really clearly the parameters around both floor area ratio minimums and parameters around the range of building heights that will be acceptable. On some of them, we were able to provide additional design codes around particular sites where those were felt to be relevant. And on the site type side, we were able to work through examples. So we provided guidance around things around form of development for aspects like this in terms of intensification, but worked through an example. And this became a sort of really useful way to provide kind of design coding at a sort of site-based level that was applicable to sort of wider sites within the borough. So it was a sort of really interesting process, and I think crucially, you know, sort of really big collaborative piece of work that has taken a huge amount of kind of refinement with the community, and as I said at the beginning, sort of very imminently about to be formally adopted. So yes, very happy to take questions, and Louise is in the audience too, so sort of anything that you'd like to know from the council side and point of view, I'm sure she'd be very happy to answer too.
Thanks, Jane. Fantastic. Thank you very much. Exactly on the time. Questions from the audience? You could lift your hands up or write on the chat if you prefer. No questions as yet. I can make a start and ask a question too. You mentioned at the beginning that you've used some GIS, but you did it quite quickly. You said we used GIS. Do you want to expand on that a little bit? How was it used? Was it just an analytical piece at the outset? Or was it...
So yes, I mean it sort of became a big bedrock actually for the whole piece of work, and I think also reflects, and Louisa can kind of come in on it a bit, of the sort of more tech-informed approach that Hounslow is very much taking forward across sort of wider pieces within the planning team too. So there was a lot of sort of baseline analysis that happened and was put through the GIS. So we had huge amount of layers, and so there's sort of lots of kind of maps that were available, and community really valued being able to kind of overlay things from air pollution that they were experiencing to kind of biodiversity to energy efficiency of existing building stock, and being able to really understand how those things were playing together. We then took some key aspects through though to how we then coded, so particularly things around prevailing building height to inform and provide the evidence for building height codes, floor area ratio in terms of the analysis, and that's sort of very much embedded within the GIS piece, and that forming the bedrock in terms of density parameters, but also the kind of urban greening piece, and I think that will continue to inform as the sort of council are keen to sort of really embed further sort of ambition on that. But Louisa, do you want to come in, because it's sort of a wider point on tech as well, I think?
Yeah, absolutely, and quite a lot of the analysis that Eliza Morisson did was really important in our tech project. So we do quite a lot of stuff around site capacities and sort of automatic generation of capacities on site. So we're able to feed in things like tall building data, both kind of existing and also kind of proposed for each area. Also the kind of having the visions in GIS layers was quite important, because we're able to kind of put that into display tools, and it allows the community to zoom in and out on the GIS layers and view that at a more granular level and explore it themselves, as opposed to kind of just seeing a static map. So yeah, quite important for that interactivity as well.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. It sounds interesting, and thanks for explaining that. Quite important. Any other questions from the audience? I can't see any hands up, unless I'm missing, but I haven't got any hands up at the moment.
I do have a question. I was wondering whether Jane and Louisa can talk a little bit more about the process behind defining the tall buildings area in the borough. I mean, what was the process that you went through in terms of defining the boundaries of those areas, really?
I think it's sort of on these sort of projects, particularly sort of character informed design codes, I think the tall buildings bit becomes one of the most important pieces. It's what local communities feel most passionately about. It's the thing that they've sort of got most rolled up about often as well. So the process that we went through was to firstly use the kind of GIS base as an analysis to understand different layers that informed sensitivity to tall buildings. There were sort of, at least 10 or 12 layers that fed into that around, whether there were sort of heritage assets and conservation areas, were there aspects around views, all the sort of levels of kind of sensitivity to tall buildings. Then there were another set of layers around suitability. And so those are sort of the classics of, public transport accessibility levels, in terms of prevailing height, the existence of existing tall buildings, although that isn't always an indicator of appropriateness. Those elements sort of all went together, and we spent quite a lot of time with Louisa and the team really sort of looking at through, should we weight any of those? Should they all have kind of equal billing? But the GIS sort of allowed us different ways to sort of cut it many times over. I think we all say with these, we can provide a huge amount of information. Ultimately, though, it will always come down to a political decision and a sort of, quite where the sort of lines get drawn. And so I think what we've tried to do here is sort of provide a really strong sort of sense and all of that information's within the guidance too. So there's a sort of real sense of this is the direction of travel. the final piece then, so they're all kind of hexagons and they sort of represent certain numbers of layers adding up together, and we then were able to kind of draw around that. But I mean, Louisa, crucially, I suppose the DM team became quite important to that, bringing their experience of tool building applications, how they deemed things to be appropriate or inappropriate, and so we were able to kind of refine quite a bit within those sort of areas that came out of the analysis.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's kind of an evolving piece as well, because the kind of Hounslow town centre master plan has a tall buildings annex in it, and it took the baseline of the tall building areas within the design codes and then refined those a little bit more, so on a site specific basis. So it's yeah, an evolving piece, but it's a really good baseline to work from to work out those suitable suitable areas for tall buildings.
Okay, we've got some questions on the chat that I'll read to you. They're linked to the tall buildings and the engagement, actually. The first is from Rachel Liggett. Would love to know more about the community engagement. And the second one from the Urban Design Group, presumably from Lynn, is interesting that the community were opposed to tall buildings. Do you think that would be the case in every London borough if the residents got the chance to voice an opinion?
Yeah, interesting. I mean, I suppose firstly, Rachel, your point in terms of the community engagement. So, you know, we started the project during COVID, and so it was, you know, it was a different way of engaging than we might perhaps have done it, sort of, you know, if we'd sort of started a year before. But actually what we found was we were able to reach quite a lot more people than we might necessarily have done. So we had an initial sort of public survey that went out. We had sort of over 700 responses, and that was more around asking people what their concerns were, what things they particularly liked around kind of design of buildings in their area, what things they thought we should really focus on as part of the design code. When we then got into the kind of community workshops, we then broke it down into those 6 areas that you saw on that map, to try and have a much more kind of detailed conversation about particular areas and neighbourhoods. That enabled us to kind of bring out what the sort of particular issues were in each area. But it is true to say that I think tall buildings and density and building height, particularly within that, came out as important across the piece. You know, we had sort of big kind of numbers of people attending each of those workshops, with, you know, really strong views on it. You know, the other aspect that came out too, you know, as others will have experienced, and the latest edition of Urban Design magazine will be on, is low traffic neighbourhoods. You know, that was also something that was on the ground at the time, and was causing kind of lots of concerns. And so there were lots of issues at play. I think what really helped in this is that there was a level of kind of trust in the community, realizing that the guidance and the codes could really start to deal with some of these tricky issues that they were worried about. And so lots of people got very invested in it and allowed us to kind of go, you know, really take that through. There was a sort of, we probably did sort of 2 key rounds of community workshops to build up towards the sort of draft design code. Louisa and her team have then taken it through sort of formal consultation, and there's sort of been adjustments sort of through that point to a kind of final version that will be adopted over the next couple of months. But yeah, it was a really interesting journey on it.
Good. I've got, sorry, this is actually my alarm for the end of your time. There is one more question that I'll read, because we have a slight tolerance of a couple of minutes, which is not about tall buildings, because I think we've answered all the ones about tall buildings. It's about the urban greening factors from Robert Huxford, from the Urban Design Group, and about how these ideas may be rolled out. Sometimes cash-strapped highway departments are very reluctant to adopt trees.
Yeah, so I mean, I suppose importantly for those outside London, you may have come across kind of the urban green factor. I mean, it's not a kind of London specific approach, but it's one that's been adopted within the London plan. So it's used in the London plan for assessing the level of greening proposed in a development. What we did was sort of for Hounslow was to flip it to using it to analyse existing neighbourhoods, and therefore give it a role as a proxy, I suppose, in terms of their resilience to future kind of climate adaptation. Where it's, you know, it's sort of set at the moment within the SPD is very much set at the sort of 0.4 and 0.3, which are the sort of baseline figures within the London plan. So it's sort of completely in conformity with that. The hope is, though, to sort of allow that figure to rise as the design code is reviewed with local plan reviews. Now, the other element within it is at sort of the area neighbourhood level. We then identified what the priorities were. So in some areas, it was residential neighbourhoods that had lost a lot of their street trees, and it was looking at kind of, are there opportunities to reintroduce those? In other pieces, it was, you know, much more about trying to maintain and conserve the existing level of greening and think about the sort of, you know, maintenance and potential kind of replacement of trees once they got to their end of their life. Now, I don't think, you know, I think, you know, Robert, your issue about the kind of, you know, highways departments being very strapped, I think there was, because alongside the code, Hounslow were doing their green infrastructure strategy too, there was already a very clear sense that this was going to be a priority for the council. And so we were able to perhaps go further than what you might be able to do in sort of other situations. But, you know, it's still guidance within a lot of that level. It isn't, we're not kind of coding and sort of absolutely requiring it. I think many ways, and because of that recognition of actually the sort of ability to roll it out, but it sort of sets the ambition strongly, I suppose.
Okay, thanks. That's very, very good. Thank you. We're moving on to the third and last presentation. So the third shortlisted design code. That's going to be Alexis Butterfield from Pollard Thomas Edwards Architects, and he's going to present as the Cherry Hinton design code, which is actually a piece prepared for a developer, as I understand. So it's going to be slightly different from the ones we've heard before, which will be quite interesting. Alexis, you able to share your screen with us?
Yes, let me just hopefully
it will
we won't have a
smooth transition.
Exactly, won't have a you wouldn't believe this, guys. We did actually practice this before.
Yes, we did. And
can you see my screen?
Yes, we can. We've got Cherry Hinton North design code page on the screen. And if you just make it full screen, you'll be ready to go. Yes, thanks. Over to you. I'll let you know when you've got 2 minutes left to the end of your time. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Okay, so yeah, so the code I'm going to show you today is a different kind of code. It's a code that we developed for one of Cambridge's eastern expansion sites on the edge of Cambridge. I've got a map later on to show you where it all is, but it's a single development, and that obviously gives you an opportunity to do a different kind of coding. The code was written with and for a joint venture between Bellway and Latimer Housing Association, and essentially we kind of took them on a journey along with the local authority and with the local people in the area. We started the project in summer 2021, and the first buildings are completing on site now. So it's an incredibly fast process as well, certainly in our experience. We kind of set out our stall very early, both with our client and then through that particularly with the local authority. We're very fortunate in the sense that Cambridge sets quite high standards for what it expects of its developments, and it's able to do that. And so that gave us a really good kind of starting point in that discussion. But essentially what we wanted was the design code to really set us on a new standard for what a house builder-led development could do. And we had sort of various different objectives about what we wanted to do with that. I think so much of it was around trying to make design that was less car focused. So it's not just reducing cars, but it's reducing the impact of cars and the impact of cars on place. And then conversely, of course, making it more walkable. And a key part of that is actually just more sociable as well. Greenness, incredibly important, and then also energy efficiency. And each of these became really sort of prime drivers in what we did. A little bit about the project. As I say, it's an edge of settlement urban extension for about 1,200 homes. It's also got 2 schools and a local centre. And we were working within an outline consent that had already been achieved by others. And that's quite an important aspect of this as well, is that so much of the code that we produced was really focused on raising quality and raising sense of place from that initial baseline, and doing that through a kind of development of a framework. The whole process lasted around 9 months. And I'll take you through the process in a second, but I think the key thing here really was that we tried to use the process itself, as well as the code, the resulting code. The process itself was used to build a degree of a really strong degree of sort of shared vision and confidence between developer, local community, and the planning authority, and local kind of and the planning committee as well. And we worked a lot to build that sense of confidence and that bigger sense of vision. That resulted in some really kind of much higher standards overall. So, for example, using a Section 73 process to really increase the sustainability of the scheme from Part L 2021, right? We increased by 70% the energy efficiency of all of the homes across the site through the design code. And we did that in part by a gas-free development. We also did things like added green spaces, about a hectare of green spaces. As I say, the processes work really quickly, which is great for our client. And there's 351 homes currently on site being developed, with the first show homes just completed now. PTE has built up a lot of experience working in Cambridge, and I think that really helped us in this case in terms of thinking about how we would code for this site, and how we would build on lessons learned from other previous developments within Cambridge. This is just a plan just showing work we've done in Cambridge. It's a bit of an advert for that, I suppose, but really sort of just shows the scale of development, I suppose, in general that's been happening in the city over the last decade. The site that we're talking about today is the Cherry Hinton site here, for 1,200 homes, and it's on the south side of the airport, which will have a future development as well. Thinking about that sort of confidence building and that sort of relationship building process, we started with a project study tour where we took our client and the key team kind of officers and strategic officers for the Greater Cambridge Planning Service. We spent a day together just going around recently delivered residential developments that have been delivered using a design code. And what we wanted to do was essentially build a really good shared idea and a shared experience of what does good look like? What are we trying to achieve? What worked, what didn't from previous codes? And by having the people who'd actually been part of those teams there on the trip, that really helped to give us a head start in what we were doing. Again, it also started to build that idea of that sort of shared vision. And that really then sort of launched what was quite a dense process of different workshops and events and processes that we went through throughout the 9 months. We essentially broke that into 4 parts, essentially a kind of a mobilization process where we brought people together, and that sort of very much culminated, I think, in that study tour. We then moved on to a principal stage, and we spent a few months together going through a series of workshops, and then working also with the local community. This was, again, there was still concerns around COVID, so much of this was online, but we were able to have quite a few processes with local residents and with the local parish council through that. What we did is we developed the site-wide principles that we were going to be applying across the code, and essentially they covered all the things that all the different aspects that we knew we wanted to put into there. So, for example, first of all, just understanding the constraints, and I gave that vision. Then moving into things like green infrastructure and streets and sustainability, and then movement frameworks, before thinking about things like design of local centre and what and how are we going to handle things like we wanted to introduce ideas around co-location. We then moved into a detail phase where we went essentially into all of the kind of coordination and application principles into all the various different kind of key areas of the coding. Finally, we then undertook a testing and completion phase, and the testing phase was really important when we held a testing process, which culminated in a testing day where we gave 3 different architect groups the code essentially to work with a part of the site and to see how they could use the code and what worked and what didn't. And then that enabled us to then do the revisions. I should say that through all of this process, we had representatives across the board in terms of different parts of the local authority. And I think the key ones here was the urban design, but also county highways, who are a particularly important consultee, as well as landscape and sustainability officers. We started off with as a basis with the 10 characteristics of the National Design Code. And we found that a really useful kind of, we tried to treat it as a bit of an aid memoir, to be honest, at that stage, of just really making sure that everything would be covered and using it, particularly when we were starting to have those sort of ideas around how we were structuring our consultation itself, as well as starting to think about how we would structure the document. However, what we realised very early on is we wanted to have more coordinated discussions with our consultees. We wanted to make sure that different aspects of those 10 characteristics weren't sort of siloed in any way, but were understood as coordinated elements. So we worked with our landscape architects, McGregor Coxall, to develop what we called a living infrastructure approach, and that essentially brought together and aligned design for public space, for movement and nature, and then also we brought in use of resources as well into that as a coordinated whole in terms of, first of all, how we would discuss those aspects, and then secondly, how we would code for them. And then conversely, we also wanted to bring together the various different aspects of building design and use, and we called that the living communities. This approach actually worked incredibly well, I must say. It's something we've been using again since. It also really helped us to keep the code quite concise as well by sort of drawing things together like this. And the code is, including appendices and checklisting, is a little over 100 pages, which is relatively concise for a design code.
Couple more minutes, Alex.
Yeah, so what we did is we used the principles of the code to develop on the outline consent a framework master plan, which essentially created distinct small pocket neighbourhoods, each one centred around a substantial green space. Those individual neighbourhoods are then interlinked onto a network of green routes. And these are traffic-free, so car-free, cycling and walking routes, active travel routes, which crisscross the whole development, and so link everything together very, very conveniently and directly. They also link together the planned secondary school right through on what we call the Ridgeway, going there sort of east-west, taking us down to the existing settlement of Cherry Hinton, and then also link up with the new Market Square and Village Green, which contains the primary school as well. We go to the next slide. The fundamental to how we were thinking was trying to sort of really see in quite a granular detail, and always thinking about things at the scale of walking and the pedestrian. So in this case, trying to show how you draw together design for buildings, design for the street, design for urban greening, and design for things like visitors and gathering and social gathering. And what you can see from these sort of diagrams is what we're trying to do is sort of thinking about what we were talking about earlier about the sort of holistic design approach. Everything is explained through diagrams. Diagrams are the key part of the code, really. In this way, they're color coded to make references to other characteristics. And then in the text itself, we use quite a controlled form of text, which then cross-references to other parts of the code through color coding as well. We've really focused in the code on areas we felt were risk factors, in particular things like parking and servicing. And so in this case, what we're looking at here was coding for things that are more than just sort of on-plot driveway parking. We're thinking how you can have parking, instead of having, say, a rear parking court, actually have parking within these sort of small kind of French residential square approaches. Also, what you can see here is how buildings were coded within the diagrams to really make sure that all frontages were engaged with the front doors or principal windows to get that sense of eyes on the street. Streets were all designed to incorporate street trees and urban greening from the outset, and also social spaces. And we work really closely with the Highways Authority to enable us to do that. And a key aspect of that, beyond the street design, also beyond thinking about designing for, in this case, thinking about all the speed limit across all streets was 20 miles an hour, going down to 15 miles an hour on smaller residential roads. But also thinking particularly, again, about things like street trees, thinking about how we could actually deliver those and make sure that the code could in asking for it, wasn't sort of setting itself up to fail, which often happens with design codes. So in this case, we set up meetings early on through the design coding process to talk about adoption, about who would manage what. And for each type of street, for each type of space, we developed this kind of diagram showing where adoption boundaries were between, in this case, the Highways Authority and the city. And working together, we were able to make sure that everything from edge to edge had an adoption, had someone looking after it, and there was an agreed strategy for how that would work.
Thanks. I think if you could conclude, Alexis,
well,
so I have some time for questions.
Just two more slides. So we've got, when we're thinking about co-location of uses, this is a really good example, this diagram of how different aspects of the different uses within the village centre could be brought together, should be brought together, in this case around a small market square, and really sort of highlighting how those different uses need to sort of focus onto that space and make it active and give it activity throughout the year. Sustainability was handled through similar diagramming processes, really emphasising things like dual aspects and cross ventilation. In this case, we were able to, in the first phase, use the code to create 94% dual aspect, and in the second phase, it's just starting now, we're at 100% dual aspect. And a lot of that was delivered through a checklisting process to ensure that that was all being delivered. And then finally, just some CGI, a CGI showing phase one of the designs that we have proposed, and then we're really excited to see those buildings just starting to be delivered, and it's feeling like the quality that we were expecting through the code is actually being lived up to on site. My apologies for taking a bit longer.
That's okay. Thank you so much. Thanks very much, Alexis. Shall we move on to some questions? If there are questions, please, as before, raise your hands or pop them on the chat. And if there are no questions, just like on the other two cases, I'll make a start. I was probably gonna ask about the adopted streets. It's the last bit you were talking about. So I presume you consulted with the Highways Authority with regards to that, to make sure they were to adoptable standards. So my question is, were there specific parts of those street sections where you consciously deviated from the Highways Authority standards? And how did you take them through that process? Were they in agreement of that? And what sort of deviation was there from the standard? And how was that coded? Was that then made compulsory? Is that sort of less compulsory? Is that more of a indicative guidance? So I'm interested in that process and in the outcome of that specifically.
No, absolutely. It was probably the most important part of the 9 months. The first thing was that from the outset, we said we were going to challenge them. We said that we really did want the code was the role of the code wasn't to enshrine existing standards. The role of the code was to really promote quality and betterment, and that included in highways design. So the first thing we did was really work very closely with them in the incorporation of street trees, but to do that through building in quite large build outs which are planted and allow for those trees to have a good chance to survive. And that meant that we had to have really quite long conversations about the pinch points we were creating. I think the second part on that was then we wanted those pinch points to also relate to crossing points, because we felt that would be a natural place to do things. We felt that would really help people to cross the road. So we worked, which initially there was quite a lot of resistance to, and we worked a lot to create things like raised tables around those pinch points as well, to create that sort of coordinated level of design, I suppose, and streetscape. So those were really important. I think finally the adoption strategy that was evolved for both the landscape and the streets had to happen kind of concurrently. Everyone had to be in the same room at the same time with the same drawing to get to a point where we could agree that highways were comfortable to have trees in their streets, and the city were comfortable that those trees were providing urban greening and social purpose. And one of the things I didn't manage to say is that this was also a key part of creating that sort of interlinked green networking, which was a really important aspect to what we were doing. We didn't want isolated bits of green, basically. We wanted continuity of greenness.
Thanks. Thank you very much. We've got more than a couple of questions on the chat. And I'll start. So to the first, when discussing matters with the highways authorities, were you dealing with their county council or their consultants? And did they discuss the required committed sums for ongoing maintenance? That's a question from Robert, from us, from the Urban Design Group.
So we were dealing directly with the council throughout it, and we asked for the commuted sums consultants, which is done as an external on the whole, to be part of it. Unfortunately, they weren't able to be, and that's been one of the lessons learned of this, is that whilst we've been able to hold on to the principles, it has proved it's been more difficult than we would have wanted it to be to translate all of those principles, which were all signed off at that stage, to the code. And I think that whilst I wouldn't change anything that we've done on it, and I'm happy to say that, I think that I would have probably forced through squealing for those consultants to be involved at those stages, because I think it's really important that everyone understands what they're signing up to. But as I say, I think the process was the right one.
Mm-hmm. What were your density targets, please? That's a question from Jacqueline Bleacher.
So we pushed the density a bit. This is obviously a suburban area with certain suburban expectations and things like that. But what we did is we pushed the densities up from around 20 to 30 homes per hectare, 20, 30, 40, up to between 30 and 60 homes per hectare. And what that's done is that's enabled us to release more space for urban greening, particularly around those green networks we were talking about. And sort of just generally improved the scheme. It feels a lot more walkable.
And that's interesting. Then another question from Jacqueline regarding neighborhood completedness. Did you specify desirable pedestrian destinations? She mentions, I noticed your market square.
We did. We did. One of the pages in the code relates to cultural and social connectivity, and that's a really sort of critical thing for us in terms of this kind of green infrastructure network, essentially interlinking all of these different aspects, but particularly thinking about, and then obviously that was helped by the fact that we co-located so much of it at the local centre, so to a certain extent we can make all roads lead to Rome in that area. The only outlier of that was where the Cambridgeshire Council had located the secondary school, which was distant from our local centre, and that was one of the reasons why we developed that sort of what I call the Ridgeway that connects both deep into the scheme with a green route, a traffic-free route, but also then links into the existing settlement as well. So it's sort of we felt it was a bit isolated, in all honesty, when we inherited the outline planning consent. So that was as well key bit of thinking.
And I've jumped one question from Peter Van Zwan. What a wonderful code. Was the 70% improvement over Part L led by council standards, or was it a developer aspiration?
It was what we did is when we picked up the existing outline consent, it had a requirement for a sort of unspecified number of exemplar homes throughout the site. And our client was actually quite worried by that. They didn't know quite how they were going to deliver it. So what we did is we brought the council and our clients together and essentially said, look, what if we just uplift everything? What if we just agree a much better uplift to everything? Don't bother with a few exemplars. It'll be simpler to deliver a better code and a better development for our client, but also it'll just be so much more beneficial. So we were so excited that we were able to do that, because it enables essentially just this huge uplift, and because once we'd started on that road, we were then able to have those really interesting conversations around things like dual aspect and stuff like that. And so very, very happy to have got to 100% dual aspect now on the whole site. So there's sort of, I think it's one of those things where once you start changing the narrative using these processes, it's amazing where you can go to. I think the other thing is just to say that because we were able to do this concurrently with the writing of the code, it's all part of building confidence as well, which I think is, again, the code is more than a document, it's a process.
Thanks very much. I think we're heading to our 10 minutes to the end of this masterclass. I think we'll probably conclude to say first, thanks very much for all the 3 shortlisted presentations. They were excellent, and to the people who asked the questions and all the discussion, I think was really, really interesting. We had different design codes. We had the more rural context, the more urban in the Hounslow, and 2 for the public sector and 1 prepared for a developer. So I think it's quite an interesting range, and all 3 very outstanding pieces of work. And so I'm not surprised there were the 3 shortlisted. We have had the judging panel composed by Alan Thompson, co-chairing with Scott Adams, Angela Coke, Daisy Narayanan, and David Rudlin, who selected these three entries and who have decided on the winning entry. I don't know if someone from the jury is here and wants to announce if perhaps the co-chairs, Scott or Alan, are here. I was looking through the list and I didn't see them. Raise your hand if you are and I missed your name. If not, I'll announce, and then I can see Angela is, and I'll leave to Angela to perhaps make a commentary to the winning entry. So I'm very happy to say congratulations to Richard and Fiona for their Somerset West and Taunton District Council Design Guide for the Districtwide, because you are the winning entry for our Design Codes Awards this year. Many congratulations, fantastic. This is kind of where you make your Oscar speech.
Thank you.
Over to you for a couple of minutes if you want, and then I'll pass over to Angela if she wants to make a commentary from the judging panel point of view. Richard, Fiona, do you want to just say a couple of words and then over to Angela?
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much.
I think it's basically something to do with the way that we all worked internally as well as externally as a team. We enjoyed the work overall. And can I just say that the subtitle of this is "For a Zero Carbon, Healthy, Resilient and Distinctive Environment." And that's what it's all about. So thank you very much. And I think the other two finalists had fantastic pieces of work, and we felt privileged to be in their company. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very, very much. And many congratulations to you, and as well as to the other shortlisted entries.